In the quaint village of St. Mary's Mead, where secrets simmer beneath the charm, beloved baker Clara Honeycutt collapses after tasting her own muffins laced with peanuts. Her deadly allergen. Was it a careless mistake, or something sinister? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle wisdom, unravels a web of jealousy and betrayal. A mislabeled jar, a rival's grudge, a hidden shed, and a young girl's guilty secret point. To Felix Dutton, whose envy of Clara's triumph at the county fair led to a dangerous prank. As whispers filled the village, Miss Marple's quiet persistence reveals the truth, restoring the golden loaf and proving that even the smallest village hides the darkest motives. Chapter 1. The Scent of Trouble. The late afternoon sun cast golden fingers through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage in St. Mary's Mead, where the air held the faint sweetness of blooming honeysuckle. Miss Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned, sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The village beyond her garden gate hummed with its usual quiet charm children, scampered home from school, and the butcher's van rattled down the lane, but a subtle discord lingered, like a mist stitch in her pattern. Something was amiss. The door burst open, and Mrs. Dolly Pantry, her cheeks flushed and her hat slightly askew, swept into the room, bringing with her a gust of agitation. "Jane, it's simply dreadful," she exclaimed, collapsing into the chintz armchair with a dramatic sigh. "Clara Honeycutt, poor Clara, our dear baker, has been rushed to hospital. They say she collapsed right after tasting her own muffins." "Muffins, Jane? Can you imagine?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes sharpening behind her spectacles. "Clara Honeycutt," she said softly, as if testing the name for hidden meaning. "That is most distressing. What precisely happened, Dolly?" Mrs. Pantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, though the room was empty save for the two of them. "It was this morning, at the Golden Loaf. Clara was testing a new recipe, something special for the village fete, I believe. She took one bite of a muffin and within minutes was gasping, clutching her throat. Dr. Haydock says it's an allergic reaction, likely to nuts. She's stable now, but only just. The bakery's shut, and the village is in an uproar." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, her mind already sifting through the details as deftly as she sorted her wool. "Nuts," she murmured. "How very curious. Clara, as I recall, is severely allergic to them. She once told my maid Cherry she checks every ingredient twice to avoid such a mishap. Her bakery is her pride, and she's meticulous. To use nuts by mistake seems unlikely." "Exactly." Mrs. Pantry threw up her hands. "That's what I said to Arthur, but he thinks it's just a careless error. Men, they never see the deeper currents, do they? I told him Clara Honey would sooner forget her own name than use nuts in her baking. Oh, Jane, what if it wasn't an accident?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She gazed out at the garden, where a blackbird hopped along the path, but her thoughts were elsewhere, turning over the village's tapestry of rivalries and secrets. She recalled her old friend, Miss Weatherby, who once misjudged a recipe and served a tart that sent her guests into a tizzy knot from poison, but from an overzealous dash of cloves. Mistakes happened, but Clara's caution suggested something more sinister. "Dolly," she said at last, her voice gentle but firm, "we mustn't leap to conclusions, though I confess the circumstances are peculiar. A baker with experience and her own allergy to contend with. No, it doesn't sit right. It reminds me of young Tommy Pierce, who swapped sugar for salt in his mother's kitchen to tease her. Harmless, perhaps, but deliberate. We must learn more. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You think someone tampered with her ingredients? Oh, Jane, that's wicked. Possibly, Miss Marple replied, rising with a sprightliness that belied her years. I think a walk to the Golden Loaf might be in order. Fresh air sharpens the mind, and I should like to see the scene for myself. As they stepped into the soft evening light, St. Mary's Mead seemed deceptively serene, its cottages glowing under thatched roofs. Yet Miss Marple, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones, felt the weight of an unseen shadow. Clara's muffins, a jar misplaced, a village full of whispers. There was a pattern here, waiting to be unravelled, like a knot in her skein of yarn. Chapter 2. The Muffin Mystery. The late morning sun filtered through the leaded windows of the Golden Loaf, casting a lattice of light across the scrubbed oak counter where Clara Honeycutt's bakery usually bustled with life. Today, however, the shop stood silent, its glass display cases empty of their usual array of scones, tarts, and gold-encrusted loaves. The faint scent of vanilla and flour lingered, but it was overlaid with a sterile Thames, as if the very air mourned the absence of its mistress. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, stepped carefully over the threshold, her eyes scanning the familiar space with the quiet intensity of a gardener inspecting a frostbitten rosebed. Inspector Craddock was already there, his broad shoulders filling the narrow kitchen doorway as he barked orders to a young constable, who was dusting a sack of flour for fingerprints with more enthusiasm than precision. Craddock's face, boyish despite his 30-odd years, broke into a wry smile as he caught sight of Miss Marple. Miss Marple, he said, half amused, half exasperated, I might have known you'd turn up. Come to solve my case for me. Not at all, Inspector, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft as the rustle of her tweed skirt. I merely thought a visit might clarify things. Clara's misfortune is most distressing, and I confess I'm curious. A baker of her caliber, struck down by her own creation. It's rather like a seamstress pricking herself with her own needle. Craddock chuckled, though his eyes remained sharp. Fair enough. But it looks straightforward to me. An allergic reaction. Dr. Haydock says nuts in the muffins. Clara must have slipped up, used the wrong ingredient. Happens to the best of them. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone less observant than Craddock. Perhaps, she said, stepping into the kitchen, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the tiled floor. But Clara is not one to slip up, Inspector. I recall her telling my maid Cherry that she labels every jar herself in that neat copper plate of hers to avoid any confusion. Her allergy is no secret, least of all to herself. No, I think we must look a little deeper. The kitchen was a model of order, even in its current disarray. Copper pans gleamed on their hooks, and shelves held rows of jars, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves all meticulously labelled, a tray of muffins, their tops golden and slightly cracked, sat on the counter, surrounded by crumbs that spoke of a hasty investigation. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a single jar, placed not among the spices, but beside a canister of flour. Its label, in Clara's distinctive hand, read oregano. How very odd, she murmured, her fingers brushing the jar's cool glass. Oregano, so prominently placed, and in a muffin recipe. Clara's creations are traditional lemon zest, perhaps, or a hint of cardamom, but oregano seems unconventional. Craddock followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. You think it's out of place? I do, Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as ever, but carrying a weight that made Craddock pause. In my experience, Inspector, things out of place are often out of purpose. I once knew a cook in St. Mary's Mead, Mrs. Clements, a dear soul who kept her sugar in a tin-marked tea because her nephew was prone to pilfering. She thought it clever, but it led to a most unfortunate sponge cake. This jar, I suspect, holds a similar secret. Craddock, accustomed to Miss Marple's knack for drawing parallels between village trifles and graver matters, gestured to the constable. Bag that jar for testing, Jenkins, and be careful about it. He turned back to Miss Marple. You're suggesting someone tampered with it? Not suggesting, Inspector, she replied, her eyes twinkling with a quiet certainty. Merely observing. Clara's care is legendary. If nuts found their way into her muffins, I doubt it was by her hand. The constable, Jenkins, a lanky young man with a nervous habit of tugging his collar, approached with a cloth bag. As he lifted the jar, a faint rattle sounded from within, not the soft shake of dried herbs, but something heavier, more granular. Miss Marple's head tilted, her mind flickering to a long-ago incident involving her cousin's boy, who hid marbles in a biscuit tin to confound his sister. "Might we open it, Inspector?" she asked. Craddock nodded, and Jenkins, with exaggerated care, unscrewed the lid. The contents spilled into a shallow dish. Not the green flakes of oregano, but a coarse, pale powder that carried the unmistakable aroma of peanuts. Craddock swore under his breath, a rare lapse for the Inspector. "Peanuts," he said, his voice tight, "in a jar labelled oregano. This is no accident." "Indeed not," Miss Marple said softly, her thoughts racing. "Someone took great pains to disguise this, grinding peanuts to mimic the texture of herbs that requires forethought, Inspector, and malice." Craddock's jaw tightened. Sabotage, then? But who'd want to harm Clara? She's the heart of this village. Her bread's practically a sacrament at the vicarage. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. Hearts, Inspector, can inspire both love and envy. Clara's success at the county fair last month was the talk of St. Mary's Mead. Her muffins took first prize, did they not? Over Mr. Felix Dutton, if I recall. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Felix Dutton, the baker from Upper Mead. He was sore about losing, wasn't he, I heard. He made a scene at the fair, claiming Clara's recipe wasn't original. "So Mrs. Price told me," Miss Marple said, referring to the postmistress, whose knack for gossip rivaled her own for observation. "Jealousy is a potent spice, Inspector. It can curdle the mildest disposition. I once knew a young woman in my knitting circle, Ethel, her name was, who ruined a rival's shawl with a snip of her scissors. All because Ethel's pattern was overlooked at a church fete. Small slights, you see," confessed her. Craddock rubbed his chin, his earlier confidence giving way to a grudging respect. "You think Felix swapped the jar to discredit Clara, or worse?" "I think nothing yet," Miss Marple said, her tone as light as the breeze outside. "But I do think we should speak to Clara, if she's well enough, and perhaps take a closer look at this kitchen. A baker's domain is like a library. Every item tells a story, if you know where to look." They moved deeper into the kitchen, where Clara's meticulous order stood in stark contrast to the morning's chaos. A ledger lay open on a side table, its pages filled with recipes in Clara's precise hand. Miss Marple scanned it, noting the new muffin recipe: flour, sugar, eggs, butter, a pinch of baking powder, and a curious addition herb blend, special. No mention of oregano, but the phrase piqued her interest. Special, she murmured. Clara was always fond of a secret ingredient. My niece's cook, Martha, used to swear by a dash of lavender in her biscuits. Perhaps Clara's herb blend was meant to be her triumph. Craddock, meanwhile, was examining the muffin tray. The remaining muffins, half a dozen or so, looked innocuous, their surfaces unmarred, save for the crumbs where Clara had broken one apart. He lifted one, sniffing cautiously. Smells like peanuts, now that I know what to look for. But why didn't she notice before baking? Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the mixing bowls, stacked neatly by the sink. She might have, she said, but if the peanuts were ground fine and mixed with flour, the scent could be masked until baking brought it out. Clara would have trusted her labelled jar. We all trust what we believe to be true. The constable returned, clutching a clipboard. Sir, the lab's taking the jar now. They'll test the muffins too. Dr. Haydock says Clara's reaction was severe. Her throat swelled almost shut. If she hadn't got to the hospital so quick, it might have been fatal. Miss Marple's hands clasped her handbag a little tighter. Fatal, she echoed softly. The word hung in the air, heavy as the flour dust that still lingered. She thought of old Mr. Hargreaves, who once nearly poisoned his wife with a mislabeled tonic. Though that was carelessness, not intent. This, she felt, was different. This was a deliberate hand at work, threading a needle through the fabric of Clara's life. Craddock paced, his boots scuffing the tiles. If Felix did this, we'll need more than a jar. Motive's one thing, but evidence is another. He's got a shop in Upper Mead, doesn't he? Might be worth a visit. A very good idea. Miss Marple agreed, though her mind was already elsewhere. Picturing Felix's Beccaria cold, efficient place, so unlike Clara's warm haven. She recalled a visit there last year, when Felix had boasted of his modern methods, his voice edged with a bitterness that Clara's simple charm seemed to provoke. But we must also consider others, she added. A village is a small place, Inspector, but its secrets are many. Clara's success might have stirred other resentments. Her assistant, perhaps, or a customer with a grudge. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Her assistant. That'd be Molly Trent, the young girl. She's barely 20, seems devoted to Clara. Devotion can mask other feelings, Miss Marple said, thinking of her gardener's lad, who adored his employer yet stole apples out of spite. Molly might know something, even if she doesn't realize it. Young people often see more than they say. They stepped outside, where the village was stirring back to life. A group of women lingered by the bakery's door, their whispers carrying on the breeze. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was among them, her sharp eyes darting to Miss Marple. Terrible business, Miss Marple, she called. Poor Clara. They say it was peanuts, but she'd never be so careless. No, indeed, Miss Marple replied, her smile polite but guarded. Carelessness is not in Clara's nature, but mistakes, Mrs. Price, can sometimes be arranged. Mrs. Price's mouth formed a small O, and the other women exchanged glances. Miss Marple moved on, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. The jar, the peanuts, the fare. Felix's anger, it was a pattern. Incomplete, but forming, like the first rows of her knitting. She thought of her friend, Miss Hartnell, who once found a letter hidden in a teapot, revealing a neighbour's betrayal. Small things, overlooked, often held the truth. Inspector, she said as they reached the lane, I think a visit to the hospital is in order. Clara may recall something, a visitor, a delivery, a moment when that jar appeared, and then, perhaps, a word with Molly Trent. Young girls notice details, even if they don't understand them. Craddock nodded, his earlier skepticism softening. You've a nose for this, Miss Marple. I'll arrange the hospital visit. But if this is sabotage, we're dealing with someone clever and dangerous. Clever, yes, Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. But danger, Inspector, often comes from the simplest motives. A slight, a grudge, a moment of envy. We shall see. As they parted, Miss Marple glanced back at the golden loaf, its shuttered windows like closed eyes. The village might seem a haven, but she knew its undercurrents, as familiar to her as the stitches in her shawl. Someone had woven a thread of malice into Clara's world, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, meant to unravel it. Chapter 3. The Village. Whisper the vicarage of St. Mary's Mead, with its ivy-clad walls and sagging gate, exuded a comforting shabbiness that invited confidences. Its drawing-room, warmed by a crackling fire, was filled that afternoon with the hum of voices as the villagers' women gathered for their weekly tea, a ritual as sacred as Sunday service. The table was laden with scones procured from Upper Mead. As Clara's bakery remained shuttered and a silver teapot steamed gently, its spout catching the firelight. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, seemed, at first glance, a mere fixture of the scene, her needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Yet her mild blue eyes, half hidden behind spectacles, missed nothing, darting from face to face like a sparrow among branches. The air was thick with talk of Clara Honeycott's calamity. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, held court near the tea-tray, her voice sharp as she recounted the morning's drama. It was dreadful, she declared, her hands fluttering for emphasis. Poor Clara, gasping for breath right there in her own kitchen. Dr. Haydock says it was peanuts, of all things, peanuts, in her muffins. She's allergic, everyone knows that. I can't fathom how she made such a blunder. Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, poured tea with a sympathetic shake of her head. Clara's no fool in her kitchen, she said. Why, she's baked for my teas for years, and never a mishap. It's not like her to be careless. Careless? Mrs. Price's eyebrows arched. That's what Mr. Dutton said, you know, Felix. Dutton, from Upper Mead. I saw him at the post office this morning, buying stamps, and he was positively smug. Said Clara's been cutting corners ever since she won that prize at the county fair. Can you imagine, accusing her of cheating, after all she's been through? Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment, as she absorbed this tidbit. Felix Dutton's name had surfaced again, like a weed breaking through soil. She recalled the county fair, a crisp autumn day when Clara's muffins, light, fragrant with a hint of some mysterious spice, had outshone Felix's dense, overworked pastries. The judges had been unanimous, and Felix's face, she remembered, had darkened like a storm cloud. Jealousy, Miss Marple knew from her observations of village life, was a quiet poison, seeping into the cracks of even the most respectable hearts. She thought of her maid Cherry's sister, who once tore a rival's dress over a slight at a dance. Small, yes, but telling. Felix Dutton, Miss Marple murmured, her voice so soft it might have been lost in the chatter, but Mrs. Harmon caught it. Oh, yes, Miss Marple, she said, passing a cup of tea. He was furious at the fair. I was there, helping with the tea tent, and I heard him muttering to his assistant Molly, isn't it? That Clara must have bribed the judges or used some trick. He's not a gracious loser, that one. Miss Marple accepted the tea, her fingers curling around the warm china. "Not gracious," she agreed, her mind turning to old Mr. Pennington, who once overturned a chessboard when bested by his nephew. Losing can bring out the worst in people, especially when pride is at stake. Clara's victory was quite the talk, wasn't it? Talk, Mrs. Price snorted, her pince-nez glinting. It was the triumph of the season. Clara's muffins were the lightest I've ever tasted, and that secret ingrediento. She wouldn't tell a soul what it was, but it was divine. Felix's were heavy as bricks. No wonder he was cross. The room buzzed with agreement, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Felix's resentment. A man like that, she mused, might not stop at muttering. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the other women, Mrs. Weatherby, who clutched her handbag as if it held state secrets, Miss Hartnell, whose loud laugh masked a shrewd mind, and young Mrs. Clemens, who seemed distracted, her fingers twisting a napkin. The village was a tapestry, and every thread, however small, could lead to the truth. As the conversation turned to the upcoming fete, Miss Marple excused herself, murmuring about needing air. She stepped into the vicarage garden, where the late roses drooped under their own weight, and considered her next move. Clara was recovering, Dr. Haydock had said, and a visit to the hospital might yield answers. But first, she wanted to hear more of the village's pulse. Gossip, she knew, was like the wind, it carried seeds of truth. If one knew how to sift them, she wandered toward the high street, where the post office stood, its red door a beacon. For news, Mrs. Price was back behind her counter, sorting letters with a practiced flick of her wrist. "Miss Marple," she called, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Come to post a letter, or are you sleuthing about poor Clara?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as benign as a Sunday hymn. "Merely stretching my legs, Mrs. Price. But since you mentioned Clara, I wonder has anyone new been about her bakery lately? Deliveries, perhaps, or visitors?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Well, now that you ask, there was a delivery van from Upper Mead last week. I saw it myself, parked outside the Golden Loaf. Not the usual supplier, mind you, some new firm. And Molly Trent was there, looking flustered, carrying a crate inside. I thought it odd, but Clara's been experimenting with new recipes, so I didn't dwell on it. A new supplier, Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind alert. How interesting. And Molly, such a devoted girl, isn't she?" "Oh, devoted, yes," Mrs. Price said, her lips pursing. "But I've seen her with Felix Dutton, you know. She runs errands for him sometimes, when Clara's busy. I don't like to speak ill, but she's young, and young girls can be swayed by a smooth talker." Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. She thought of her niece's maid, who once fell under the spell of a charming grocer, only to find he'd been pilfering from the till. Loyalty, she knew, could waver under pressure. "Thank you, Mrs. Price," she said. "You've been most helpful." Her next stop was the hospital, a small brick building on the edge of the village, where Clara lay in a private room, her face pale against the starched pillows. Dr. Haydock, a gruff man with a kind heart, met Miss Marple at the door. "She's weak but awake," he said. "No visitors, strictly speaking, but I'll make an exception for you, Miss Marple. You've a way of cheering people up." Clara's eyes fluttered open as Miss Marple entered, her knitting bag tucked under her arm for propriety's sake. "Miss Marple," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're kind to come. I still can't believe ippy nuts in my muffins. I'd never be so foolish." "Of course not, dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair beside the bed. "You're far too careful. Tell me, Clara, about this new recipe. You mentioned a special herb blend at the fair, didn't you?" Clara nodded, her fingers plucking at the blanket. "Yes, a touch of my own mixed basil, thyme, a hint of something else. I keep it in a jar, labeled herb blend, but I ran out last week. I ordered more oregano to replace it from a new supplier in Upper Mead. The jar arrived 2 days ago, unopened. I used it straight away, thinking it was safe." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A new supplier," she said, echoing Mrs. Price's words. "And you're certain the jar was unopened?" "As certain as I can be," Clara said, her brow furrowing. "The seal was intact, but, oh, I don't know. It looked right, but I was in a rush. Molly helped unpack it, and she said it was fine." "Molly," Miss Marple repeated, her tone gentle. "She's been a great help to you, hasn't she?" Clara's face softened. "A dear girl, though a bit flighty. She's been distracted lately. Something about a young man, I think. But she's loyal, Miss Marple. I trust her." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her mind racing. Loyalty, she knew, could be a fragile thing, like the lace she knitted for her goddaughter. "Rest now, dear," she said. "We'll get to the bottom of this." As she left the hospital, the evening air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving a pattern. The jar, the supplier, Molly's distraction, Felix's bitterness, it was a knot, tangled but not unbreakable. She recalled a long-ago incident in her youth, when a neighbour's boy swapped laudanum for cough syrup, thinking it a prank. The consequences had been dire, and she wondered if this act, too, had been meant as a jest gone wrong, or something darker. Back in her cottage, she lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The village was quiet now, its lights winking through the dusk, but Miss Marple felt the stir of something unseen, like a draught in a closed room. Felix Dutton's name loomed large, but she wasn't ready to fix on him alone. Molly's role, however small, nagged at her, and the new supplier raised questions. Was it a simple delivery, or a vehicle for malice? She thought of her old friend, Miss Pollitt, who once found a forged letter in a parish register revealing a betrayal. Small clues, she knew, could unravel great mysteries. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit Felix's bakery in Upper Mead, not to accuse, but to observe. People, she had learned, revealed themselves in their habits, the way they polished a counter or avoided a glance. And Molly, perhaps, could be persuaded to share a confidence over a cup of tea. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to her garden, where the last roses clung to their stems, defiant against the coming frost. Truth, she thought, was much the same, fragile but tenacious, if one knew where to look. Chapter 4. A closer look. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary's Mead, draping the village in a soft, silvery veil that muffled the clatter of milk bottles and the distant bark of a dog. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill, stepped out of her cottage, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. Her destination was the Golden Loaf, Clara Honeycott's bakery, which stood forlorn with its shutters drawn, like a house in mourning. The events of the past days, Clara's collapse, the discovery of peanuts in a jar labelled oregano, had stirred the village into a quiet frenzy, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and keen eyes, meant to unravel the thread of malice woven into the baker's misfortune. She arrived at the bakery just as the sun began to burn through the mist, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Inspector Craddock had granted her permission to examine the premises, a concession made, with a mix of reluctance and respect for her uncanny knack for noticing what others overlooked. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Miss Marple stepped inside, the bell above the door giving a faint, mournful jingle. The air was still heavy with the ghost of baked goods yeast and sugar, now tinged with the sterile scent of disuse. She paused, her eyes sweeping the shop, taking in the empty display cases, the polished counter, and the doorway to the kitchen where the trouble had begun. The kitchen was as orderly as she remembered, a testament to Clara's meticulous nature. Copper pans hung in neat rows, their surfaces gleaming like polished armor. Shelves held jars of spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspicy tray labeled in Clara's precise copper plate. But it was the counter that drew Miss Marple's attention, where a single jar still stood, slightly askew, as if forgotten in the chaos of the investigation. Its label read oregano, though she knew from yesterday's discovery that it contained ground peanuts. A deception as deliberate as it was dangerous. She approached the jar, her fingers brushing its cool glass, and recalled her conversation with Clara at the hospital. The baker had been adamant. The jar was new, its seal unbroken, delivered from a supplier in Upper Mead. Miss Marple's mind flickered to a long-ago incident in her youth, when her friend Mrs. Arbuthnot found rat poison in a sugar tin, placed there by a spiteful housemaid. Such acts, she knew, were rarely careless. They required intent, a hand guided by resentment, or worse. She lifted the jar, noting its weight, and gave it a gentle shake. The contents shifted with a gritty rustle, unlike the soft clatter of dried herbs. "Not oregano," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the silent kitchen. But why disguise it so carefully? She set the jar down and turned her attention to the pantry, a narrow alcove lined with shelves of ingredients. Flour sacks stood sentinel at the base, their canvas sides pristine, while above them, jars of dried fruits, sugars, and grains were arranged with military precision. Miss Marple ran her eyes over each label, her mind alert for anomalies. Clara's system was flawless, yet the rogue jar had slipped through like a false note in a familiar tune. She thought of her nephew's wife, who once mistook cumin for cinnamon in a fit of distraction. But Clara was no such scatterbrain. No, this was no accident. As she scanned the shelves, her gaze caught on a small notebook tucked behind a tin of baking powder. She eased it out, careful not to disturb the surrounding items, and opened it to find Clara's handwriting, a ledger of deliveries and orders. The most recent entry, dated 2 days before the incident, noted oregano 1, LB Upper Mead Supplies, delivered 10 a.m. Molly received. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Molly Trent, Clara's young assistant, had been mentioned before by Mrs. Price with a hint of suspicion, and by Clara with trust. The girl was a thread in this tapestry, but whether she was a victim or a conspirator remained unclear. Miss Marple slipped the notebook into her handbag, intending to return it after study, and continued her inspection. The mixing bowls, stacked by the sink, were spotless, but one bore faint traces of a powdery residue, as if hastily cleaned. She leaned closer, her spectacles glinting, and detected a faint, nutty scent. "Curious," she said softly, thinking of her old gardener, who once found a trace of weed killer in a watering can, left by a careless hand. She made a mental note to ask Craddock if the bowls had been tested, though she suspected the evidence had been washed away. The back door, leading to a small yard where Clara kept her herb garden, was slightly ajar. Its latch worn. Miss Marple pushed it open, stepping into the cool air. The garden was a tidy patch of rosemary, thyme, and basil, their leaves damp with mist. She bent to examine a rosemary sprig, her fingers brushing its needles, and considered Clara's special herb blend. Could the peanuts have been mistaken for herbs by an innocent hand, or was the substitution deliberate, designed to exploit Clara's allergy? The precision of the act suggested the latter, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. She recalled her friend Miss Pollitt, who once unravelled a theft by noticing a single misplaced teacup. Small details, she knew, were the keys to larger truths. Returning to the kitchen, she was joined by Inspector Craddock, his coat dusted with mist and his expression one of barely concealed impatience. "Miss Marple," he said, "found anything to make my job harder?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a gentle mischief. "Only a few threads to tug, Inspector. This jar, for instance," she gestured to the oregano container, "was no mistake. Someone ground peanuts to mimic herbs, a task requiring both cunning and effort. And this notebook," she patted her handbag, "confirms a delivery from Upper Mead, received by Molly Trent. I wonder if we might learn more about this supplier." Craddock's brow furrowed. "You're still on about Sabotage. I've got the lab testing the jar and muffins, but I'm half inclined to think Clara misread a label. She was rushed, trying a new recipe." "Clara does not misread labels," Miss Marple interrupted, her tone mild but firm. "I once saw her scold a delivery boy for mixing up vanilla and almond extract. She has the nose of a bloodhound for her ingredients. No, Inspector, this was deliberate. The question is, by whom?" Craddock rubbed his chin, his skepticism wavering. "Felix Dutton's the obvious candidate. He's got motive. Losing to Clara at the fair stung his pride. And Upper Mead's his patch. Maybe he slipped something to the supplier." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "But we mustn't narrow our view too soon. A village is a web, Inspector, and every strand connects. Molly, for instance, she's young, impressionable. Mrs. Price mentioned seeing her with Felix. Could she have been persuaded, knowingly or not, to play a part?" Craddock's eyes widened. "Molly, she's barely out of school. You'd think she'd poison her own employer." "Not poison, necessarily," Miss Marple said, adjusting her shawl. "But young people can be swayed. I recall a girl in my knitting circle, Agnes, who hid a rival's needles out of spite, egged on by a jealous friend. Molly may have acted without understanding the consequences, or she may know more than she's said." Craddock sighed, his breath visible in the cool kitchen. "Air. You see plots everywhere, Miss Marple. But I'll grant you the jar's suspicious. I'll have a word with Molly, and I've already sent Jenkins to check on this Upper Mead supplier. If it's a front for Dutton, we'll find out. Day." "Wise move," Miss Marple said, her eyes drifting to the back door. "And perhaps, Inspector, you might look into this yard. The door was ajar, and Clara's garden is just beyond. Someone could have slipped in, unseen, to place that jar. A delivery need not come through the front." Craddock followed her gaze, his expression sharpening. "You think someone sneaked in? That's bold." "Boldness is often born of desperation," Miss Marple replied, thinking of her cousin's son, who once climbed a trellis to steal a pie, only to be caught by his own muddy boots. A quick visit, a swapped jar, and no one the wiser. The garden path leads to the lane, and from there anyone could vanish into the village. They stepped into the yard, where the mist was lifting, revealing the neat rows of Clara's herbs. Craddock examined the gate, its hinges creaking faintly. No lock, he noted. Easy enough for someone to slip through. But we'd need footprints, a witness, something solid. Solid evidence comes in time, Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the ground. A patch of earth near the gate was slightly disturbed, as if trodden by a careless foot, but the mist had softened any clear prints. She made no comment, knowing Craddock would dismiss it as conjecture, but filed it away, like a stitch held for. Later, back inside, she lingered by the counter, her fingers brushing the ledger's edge in her handbag. "Inspector," she said, "might I suggest a visit to Upper Mead? Not just the supplier, but Felix Dutton's bakery. A man's surroundings often betray his thoughts, and Mollishy might respond better to a gentle question than a constable's badge." Craddock nodded, his earlier resistance softening. "You've a way of making me see shadows, Miss Marple. All right, we'll go to Upper Mead tomorrow, and I'll talk to Molly, though I doubt she's our mastermind." "Doubt is a useful tool," Miss Marple said, her smile faint but knowing. "It keeps us looking. Like my old friend, Mrs. Eldridge, who found a stolen brooch in a flower pot because she doubted the gardener's smile." As they left the bakery, locking the door behind them, the village was stirring to life. Children ran past, their laughter sharp in the crisp air, and Mrs. Price waved from her post office, her eyes hungry for news. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind weaving the threads of the jar, the delivery, Molly's distraction, Felix's grudge. Each was a piece of a larger pattern, like the motifs in her shawl, and she felt certain that the truth, however hidden, would emerge with patience. She thought of Clara, pale but resolute in her hospital bed, and of the villagers' trust in the golden loaf. Someone had betrayed that trust, slipping a deadly ingredient into Clara's sanctuary. Miss Marple's eyes, soft but unyielding, scanned the horizon, where the mist was giving way to a pale blue sky. The truth, she knew, was like the sun. It would break through if one only waited. Chapter 5. The rival's shadow. The road to Upper Mead wound through fields of fading barley, their golden stalks swaying under a sky streaked with the pale promise of autumn. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the passenger seat of Inspector Craddock's modest police car, gazed out at the landscape, her hands folded neatly over her black handbag. The morning was crisp, the air carrying a hint of wood smoke, and her thoughts were as sharp as the frost that edged the hedgerow. Their destination was Felix Dutton's bakery, a place she had visited only once before, but which now loomed large in the tapestry of Clara Honeycutt's misfortune. The discovery of ground peanuts in a jar labelled oregano, coupled with Felix's bitterness over his loss at the county fair, had cast a shadow over the rival baker, and Miss Marple meant to examine it closely. Upper Mead was a larger village than St. Mary's Mead, its high street lined with shops that boasted a certain modern ambition, neon signs, polished windows, a bustle that felt almost urban compared to the sleepy charm of Clara's domain. Felix's bakery, the Mead oven, stood at the far end, its facade stark and functional, with none of the cosy warmth that defined the golden loaf. Its sin, painted in bold black letters, seemed to proclaim efficiency rather than welcome, and the glass door was spotless, reflecting the grey sky like a mirror. Miss Marple, stepping out of the car, adjusted her shawl and noted the contrast. "A place reflects its master," she murmured, thinking of her old friend Mrs. Langley, whose pristine parlour betrayed a need for control that spilled into her quarrels. Craddock, his coat buttoned against the chill, glanced at her. "You're expecting to find a confession written on the walls, Miss Marple?" "Not quite, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft but laced with a quiet certainty. "But walls, like people, have a way of whispering their secrets if one listens. Shall we?" Inside, the bakery was as orderly as its exterior suggested. Stainless steel counters gleamed under harsh lights, and the display cases held rows of pastries perfectly shaped, but lacking the rustic charm of Clara's creations. The air smelled of yeast and sugar, but it was a clinical scent devoid of the buttery warmth that lingered in the golden loaf. Felix Dutton stood behind the counter, a wiry man in his late 40s, his apron pristine despite the hour. His hands moved with restless energy, polishing an already spotless surface, and his eyes dark and quick-flicked toward the door as the bell chimed. When he saw Miss Marple and Craddock, his expression tightened, though he forced a smile. That was more grimace than greeting. "Inspector Craddock," Felix said, his voice clipped. "And Miss Marple, isn't it? To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to sample my brioche. It's better than anything you'll find in St. Mary's Mead." Miss Marple's lips curved in a polite smile, her eyes noting the tension in Felix's shoulders. "How kind," she said, "but I'm afraid we're here on less pleasant business. Clara Honeycutt's accident has troubled us all, and we're seeking to understand how it happened." Felix's hand paused mid-polish, his knuckles whitening round the cloth. "Accident," he said, his tone flat. "Tragic, of course, but I don't see what it's got to do with me. Clara's careless, that's all. Everyone knows she's allergic to nuts. Should have checked her ingredients." Craddock's jaw tightened, but Miss Marple spoke before he could. "Careless is a strong word, Mr. Dutton," she said, her voice gentle but probing, like a needle testing a seam. "Clara is known for her precision. I recall her telling my maid Cherry that she inspects every delivery with a jeweler's eye. It's curious, don't you think, that peanuts found their way into her kitchen?" Felix's eyes darted to the side, then back, a movement so quick it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant soul. "Curious, maybe," he said, resuming his polishing with unnecessary vigor, "but mistakes happen. Maybe her assistant, her name, Molly, slipped up. Young girls aren't reliable." Miss Marple's head tilted, her mind flickering to a long-ago incident in her youth, when a grocer's boy hid spoiled fruit in a barrel to avoid a scolding. Deflection, she knew, was often a sign of unease. "Molly is young, indeed," she said, "but devoted to Clara, and the jar in question was labelled oregano, yet contained peanuts, ground to mimic herbs. That suggests a deliberate hand, Mr. Dutton, not a careless one." Felix's polishing slowed, his eyes narrowing. "You're accusing me, aren't you? Because I lost to Clara at that blasted fair. I'm not the only one who thought her win was fishy. Her muffins had some tricksome ingredient she wouldn't name. Cheating, if you ask me." Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Cheating's a serious charge, Dutton, and tampering with someone's ingredients is worse. That jar came from a supplier in Upper Meteor territory. Care to explain?" Felix's face reddened, his hands balling into fists. "I don't know anything about her suppliers. I run a bakery, not a spy ring. If you've got no proof, you're wasting my time." Miss Marple's eyes drifted past Felix to the back of the shop, where a glass door led to a small yard. Beyond it, she glimpsed a shed, its door slightly ajar, a detail that tugged at her memory like a loose stitch. She thought of her neighbor, Mr. Giles, who once hid stolen apples in his barn, believing no one would look there. Mr. Dutton, she said, her tone as mild as ever, you must be very busy with the village fete approaching. I hear you're judging the baking contest. Quite an honor. Felix's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. Yes, well, someone has to keep standards up. Clara's not the only one who can bake, you know. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. I look forward to seeing your contribution. Perhaps we might have a quick look at your storeroom, purely to compare notes with Clara's setup. Felix hesitated, his fingers twitching on the cloth. Storeroom's private, he said curtly. Trade secrets, you understand. Craddock's patience snapped. This is a police matter, Dutton. We can look now, or I can come back with a warrant. Felix's lips thinned, but he jerked his head toward the back. Fine, nothing to hide. The storeroom was a stark contrast to Clara's cozy pantry. Shelves of metal, not wood, held in canisters of flour, sugar, and spices, all labelled in a utilitarian scrawl. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the rows, noting the absence of personal touches, no handwritten labels. No hint of the warmth that defined Clara's kitchen, but what caught her attention was a small crate in the corner, half covered by a tarp. Its label read Upper Mead Supplies, the same name Clara's notebook had mentioned. Interesting, Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. This supplier seems to serve both you and Clara. A coincidence, perhaps. Felix's face darkened. Lots of bakers use them. Cheap, reliable. Doesn't mean I'm sneaking into Clara's kitchen. Craddock, meanwhile, was examining a stack of flour sacks, his fingers brushing their seams. These look new, he said. Delivered recently. Last week, Felix muttered. What's it to you? Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the threads. The supplier, the crate, Felix's defensiveness. It was a pattern, incomplete but suggestive. She thought of her old friend Miss Weatherby, who once found a forged receipt in a grocer's ledger, revealing a scheme to overcharge. Small connections, she knew, could lead to larger truths as they returned to the shop. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the shed outside. Mr. Dutton, she said, pausing by the glass door, that shed of yours, do you store ingredients there as well? Felix's eyes flicked to the shed, then away. Just tools, old sacks, nothing you'd care about. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a breeze. But I find sheds terribly interesting. They're like attics, full of forgotten things. My gardener's boy once hid a broken rake in one, thinking no one would notice. Felix's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Craddock, sensing her direction, made a note. We'll need to check that shed, Dutton. Just routine, Felix echoed, his voice bitter. You're fishing, Inspector. You've got nothing. As they stepped outside, Miss Marple glanced back at the shed, its door still ajar, a sliver of darkness within. She felt a prickle of certainty, like the moment she found a dropped stitch in her knitting. Something was hidden there, she was sure, just as she was sure Felix's bluster masked a deeper unease. Back in the car, Craddock drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. He's hiding something, he said. That should I'll get Jenkins to take a look tomorrow, but we're still short on proof. The suppliers are lead, but it's thin. Thin threads make strong cloth, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her eyes on the passing fields. Felix's manner betrays him. He's too quick to deflect, too eager to blame Clara's assistant. And that shed, why guard it so fiercely? I recall a case in my youth when a farmer hid stolen grain in his barn, thinking it safe. A single sack, overlooked, brought him down. Craddock glanced at her, a grudging smile tugging at his lips. You've a memory like a steel trap, Miss Marple. What's next then, Molly Trent? Yes, she said, her voice thoughtful. Molly may hold a piece of this puzzle, even if she doesn't know it. And the supplier Uppermead supplies. We must learn who owns it, who delivers for it. A delivery van, Mrs. Price said, was seen at Clara's. If it connects to Felix, we may have our knot. As they drove back to St. Mary's Mead, the sun broke through, gilding the fields. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Molly, the young assistant whose loyalty Clara praised, yet whose distraction hinted at secrets. She thought of her niece's maid, who once hid a love letter in a teapot, too shy to confess her feelings. Young people, she knew, could be unwitting pawns in a larger game. And Felix, with his sharp eyes and sharper temper, was no stranger to games. The village came into view, its cottages huddled under thatched roofs, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle over her. The peanuts, the jar, the supplier. The shed, each was a stitch in a pattern, and she was determined to see it whole. Truth, she knew, was like her knitting. Patient work revealed its shape, one careful loop at a time. Chapter 6. The hidden jar. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields of Uppermead, gilding the rooftops and lending a deceptive warmth to the crisp air. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag clutched firmly, stood at the edge of Felix Dutton's bakery yard, her eyes fixed on the shed that had caught her attention during her earlier visit. Its weathered door, still slightly ajar, seemed to beckon, a silent invitation to uncover what lay within. Inspector Craddock, at her side, adjusted his hat, his expression a blend of skepticism and curiosity. He had agreed to search the shed, albeit with a grumble about chasing Miss Marple's hunches. But her quiet persistence had a way of bending even his practical mind, really. Miss Marple, Craddock said, his breath visible in the cool air, you think Dutton's hiding something in there? It's probably just rusty tools and cobwebs. Perhaps, she replied, her voice as soft as the rustle of her tweed skirt. But sheds, Inspector, are like old trunks, they hold more than one expects. I recall my cousin's gardener, Mr. Hodge, who kept a stolen silver teapot in his shed, thinking it safe from prying eyes. A single glance betrayed him. Craddock's lips twitched, but he signalled to Constable Jenkins, who stood ready with a notebook and a flashlight. All right, Jenkins, he said. Let's have a look. But if we find nothing but shovels, Miss Marple owes me a cup of tea. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though she said nothing, her thoughts already weaving through the threads of the mystery. The jar of peanuts labelled oregano in Clara's kitchen, Felix's bitterness over his loss at the county fair, the mysterious delivery from Uppermead supplies, all pointed to a deliberate act, and the shed, she felt, was a knot in the pattern. She thought of her old friend Miss Lavinia, who once found a hidden letter in a garden shed, revealing a neighbour's deceit. Small spaces, she knew, often concealed large truths. The shed door creaked as Jenkins pushed it open, revealing a dim interior cluttered with sacks, crates, and gardening tools. The air was musty, heavy with the scent of damp wood and flower dust. Miss Marple stepped inside, her sensible shoes careful on the uneven floor, and scanned the space with the precision of a seamstress inspecting a hem. The shed was larger than it appeared from outside, its walls lined with shelves holding old paint cans and bags of potting soil. A stack of flour sacks, identical to those in Felix's storeroom, stood in one corner, their canvas sides slightly frayed. "Careful, Jenkins," Craddock said, as the constable began shifting the sacks. "If there's anything here, it'll be hidden well." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a corner where a tarp, carelessly draped, covered a pile of crates. She moved toward it, her movements unhurried but purposeful, and lifted the edge of the tarp with her gloved hand. Beneath it was a small crate, its wood splintered, but its label clear. Upper Mead Supplies. Her heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "Inspector," she said softly, "you might want to see." This Craddock joined her, his brow furrowing as he read the label. "Same supplier as Clara's jar," he said. "Could be a coincidence." "Coincidences," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "are like drop stitches. They rarely happen by chance. Might we look inside?" Jenkins pried open the crate, revealing a single glass jar, identical in size and shape to the one in Clara's kitchen. Its label, in a neat but unfamiliar hand, read oregano. Craddock's eyes narrowed as he lifted it, giving it a cautious shake. The contents rustled softly, like dried leaves, and a faint herbal scent wafted out. When he unscrewed the lid, "Oregano," he said, almost disappointed. "Real oregano this time." Miss Marple leaned closer, her spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Indeed," she said, her mind racing. "2 jars, Inspector, 1 false, filled with peanuts. In Clara's kitchen, 1 true, hidden here. It suggests a swap, does it not? Someone took Clara's real oregano and left a deadly substitute." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Dutton," he said. He had access, motive loosing that fair stung him deep, and this sheds his... He could have hidden the real jar here after swapping it. Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes were thoughtful. "Felix is the obvious thread, but we mustn't pull too hard yet. The supplier connects them both, and Molly Trent received the delivery at Clara's. She may know more than she realizes, more than she said." Jenkins, who had been poking through the crates, called out, "Sir, there's something else behind the sacks." He tugged aside a heavy flour bag, revealing a small burlap pouch tucked against the wall. Inside were a few stray peanut shells, their husks cracked and brittle. Craddock swore under his breath, a rare lapse for the decorum-conscious inspector. "Peanuts," he said. "Right here in Dutton's shed. That's no coincidence." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind flickering to a long-ago incident in St. Mary's Mead, when a boy hid stolen cherries in a shed, thinking them safe, until a magpie betrayed him with its chatter. "No, indeed," she said. "Someone ground those peanuts, Inspector, and took care to disguise them. This shed is a hiding place, but for whom? Felix perhaps saw someone using his space." Craddock bagged the pouch and jar, his expression grim. "This is enough to bring Dutton in for questioning. But we need more to tie him to Clara's kitchen. A witness, a fingerprint, something solid." "Solid evidence comes with patience," Miss Marple said, her voice as calm as the mist. "Outside, like my old friend Mrs. Eldridge, who found a stolen brooch in a flower pot because she watched and waited. We must watch Felix closely, and Molly, too. Young girls see things, even if they don't understand them." They stepped out of the shed, the air cooler now as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Felix was waiting by the bakery's back door, his arms crossed, his eyes darting between Craddock and Miss Marple. "Find what you were looking for," he asked, his tone sharp. Or just wasting my time? Craddock held up the bagged jar, his voice steady. Care to explain this, Dutton? Oregano, just like the jar in Clara's kitchen, and peanut shells hidden in your shed. Felix's face paled, but he recovered quickly, his voice rising. You planted that. I don't keep. Peanuts here, never have. Someone's setting me up. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze was piercing. Setting you up, Mr. Dutton, that's a serious claim. But if someone did, they chose your shed carefully. Why might that be? Felix's mouth opened, then closed, his hands clenching. I don't know, he muttered. But I didn't touch Clara's kitchen. I'm no poisoner. Craddock's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. You're coming with us for a chat, Dutton, and don't try to run. As Jenkins escorted Felix to the car, Miss Marple lingered by the shed, her thoughts turning to Molly Trent. The girl's name kept surfacing, her presence at Clara's during the delivery, her errands for Felix, her distraction. Miss Marple recalled her niece's maid, who once hid a love letter in a teapot, too shy to confess her feelings. Could Molly be caught in a similar tangle, loyal to Clara but swayed by Felix's influence? Or was she merely a witness, unaware of the role she played? Back in St. Mary's Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the fire crackling as she pondered the day's findings. The jar in Felix's shed was a crucial thread, but the pattern was still incomplete. The supplier, up at Mead Supplies, remained a shadow, its ownership unclear, its deliveries a potential conduit for malice. She thought of her old friend Miss Hartnell, who once traced a stolen necklace to a delivery boy who thought himself above suspicion. Could the supplier be a front, or an innocent link exploited by a cunning hand? She opened Clara's notebook, borrowed from the bakery, and studied the entry again. Oregano, £1, Upper Mead Supplies, delivered 10 a.m. Molly received. The simplicity of the note belied its significance. Molly had handled the jar, but had she noticed anything amiss? Miss Marple resolved to speak with her, perhaps over tea, where a gentle question could loosen a guarded tongue. The village was quiet now, its lights winking through the dusk, but Miss Marple felt the stir of something unseen, like a draught in a closed room. Felix's shed had yielded a secret, but not the whole truth. She thought of Clara recovering in hospital, and of the trust the village placed in her bakery. Someone had betrayed that trust, weaving a thread of danger into her sanctuary. Miss Marple's eyes, soft but unyielding, drifted to her knitting, where a new row waited. The mystery, like her shawl, was taking shape, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. The Village Fair. The village hall of St. Mary's Mead, with its weathered beams and polished wooden floor, was a hive of activity as the annual fete drew near. Bunting in cheerful reds and blues draped the walls, and trestle tables groaned under the weight of jam jars, knitted scarves, and jars of homemade chutney, all destined for the stalls. The air carried the mingled scents of beeswax, polish, and brewing tea, a comforting backdrop to the chatter of volunteers preparing for the event. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, seemed at first glance a mere spectator, her needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Yet her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing, darting from face to face as the villagers' pulse beat around her. The fete was a tradition older than most of the villages, a celebration of harvest and community. But this year it was overshadowed by the shadow of Clara Honeycutt's misfortune. The golden loaf remained shuttered, its absence keenly felt, and whispers of peanuts and sabotage rippled through the hall like a chill wind. Miss Marple, her mind weaving through the threads of the mystery, the jar of peanuts labelled oregano, the hidden jar in Felix Dutton's shed, the mysterious delivery from Upper Mead Supplies, knew the fate would bring the village together, and with it the chance to observe those threads more closely. At the centre of the hall stood Felix Dutton, his wiry frame taut with self-importance as he addressed the fate committee. He had been named head judge of the baking contest, a role that lent him an air of authority he wore like a too-tight coat. His voice, sharp and commanding, carried over the hum of conversation. Standards must be upheld, he declared, gesturing to a table where sample cakes were being arranged. No shortcuts, no tricks. We'll have a fair competition, unlike certain other events. The barb was not lost on the room. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who was arranging a tray of scones, shot Miss Marple a knowing glance. "He means Clara's win at the county fair," she whispered, leaning close. "Still sore about it, isn't he? You'd think he'd let it go, with poor Clara in hospital." Miss Marple's needles paused, her lips pursing slightly. "Some wounds fester, Mrs. Price," she said softly, her thoughts turning to her old friend Mrs. Langley, whose grudge over a lost embroidery prize had led to a decade of snubs. Felix's pride took a blow, and pride, you know, is a fragile thing. Her gaze shifted to Molly Trent, Clara's young assistant, who stood near the tea urn, her hands fidgeting with a stack of napkins. Molly's cheeks were flushed, her eyes darting nervously toward Felix whenever he spoke. Miss Marple noted the girl's unease, recalling her niece's maid, who fidgeted in much the same way when hiding a sweetheart's letter. Molly, she suspected, was caught in a tangle loyal to Clara, yet tied to Felix by some thread she had yet to unravel. The meeting turned to logistic store placements, the children's games, the baking contest rules, but Miss Marple's attention remained on Felix. His movements were brisk, his smile forced, and when a volunteer mentioned Clara's absence, his jaw tightened, a fleeting crack in his composure. She thought of young Tommy Pierce, who once overturned a milk jug in a fit of temper when bested at marbles. Felix's resentment, she felt, was a similar spark, capable of igniting something far worse than spilled milk. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple slipped her knitting into her bag and approached Molly, who was now pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. "Molly dear," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "you've been working so hard for the fete. It must be difficult, with Clara away." Molly started, nearly spilling the tea. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice high. "It's awful, isn't it? Poor Miss Honeycutt. I keep thinking I should have noticed something, checked the jar better." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "You couldn't have known, dear," she said, patting Molly's arm. "But tell me, that delivery from Upper Mead Supplies, you received it, didn't you? Did anything strike you?" As odd, Molly's eyes widened, then dropped to the teapot. "It was just a crate," she said, her words rushed. "The jar was sealed, like always. I put it in the pantry, and Miss Honeycutt used it the next day. I didn't think, I should have checked." There, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but her questions precise. "You did your duty. But was anyone else about when the delivery came? A stranger, perhaps, or someone from the village?" Molly hesitated, her fingers twisting. "The napkin. No strangers," she said finally. "But Mr. Dutton was by the shop that morning. He sometimes drops in to talk to Miss Honeycutt about recipes. He was there before the van arrived, but he left quick." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "Felix Dutton," she said, as if merely curious. "How kind of him to visit. Did he go near the pantry, do you recall?" Molly's cheeks flushed deeper. "I don't think so," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was busy, you see, unpacking flour, but he was in the kitchen for a bit." "Oh, Miss Marple, you don't think he—" "Not at all, dear." Miss Marple interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "I'm only trying to picture the scene. You've been most helpful." As Molly hurried back to her tasks, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind racing. Felix's presence at the Golden Loaf on the morning of the delivery was a new thread, one that tied him closer to the crime. She recalled her gardener's boy, who once slipped a frog into a neighbor's milk churn, thinking it a harmless prank. Could Felix have acted on impulse, swapping the jar in a moment of spite? Or was his plan colder, more calculated? The hall was emptying now, volunteers drifting out into the evening air, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Felix as he packed up his notes. He moved with a restless energy, his glances darting toward the door as if expecting trouble. When he caught her watching, he forced another smile, but it was brittle, like a cracked teacup. "Still here, Miss Marple," he called, his tone overly hearty. "Hoping to enter the baking contest?" "Oh no," she replied, her smile disarming. "My talents lie elsewhere, but I do enjoy watching a competition unfold." "You must be looking forward to judging quite a responsibility." Felix's smile faltered. "Someone has to do it," he said, his voice tight. "Clara's not here to steal the show this time." The words hung in the air, sharp and unguarded. Miss Marple's needles, now back in her hands, clicked softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts. "Clara's absence is felt," she said, her tone neutral. "Her muffins were the talk of the fair, weren't they? Such a pity about her accident." Felix's eyes narrowed, but he turned away, busying himself with a stack of papers. "Accident," he muttered. "She should have been more careful." Miss Marple said nothing, her silence more probing than any question. She thought of her old friend Miss Pollitt, who once coaxed a confession from a thief by saying nothing at all, letting guilt fill the quiet. Felix's discomfort was palpable, a thread she would tug later, but for now she rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Outside, the village was settling into dusk, the sky a soft lavender streaked with gold. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, her mind weaving the day's observations into the larger pattern. Felix's presence at Clara's, Molly's nervousness, the hidden jar in the schedule were pieces of a puzzle, and she felt the shape of the truth emerging like a motif in her knitting. But there were still gaps, threads that refused to align. The supplier, Upper Mead Supplies, remained a shadow, its role unclear. Was it a front for Felix's scheme, or an innocent link exploited by another? Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, the fire casting a warm glow over her knitting. She opened Clara's notebook, its pages a map of the baker's world, and studied the delivery entry again. Oregano. £1, Upper Mead Supplies, delivered. 10 a.m. Molly received. The simplicity of the note belied its weight. Molly's account placed Felix at the scene, a detail he had not volunteered. Miss Marple thought of her cousin's son, who once hid a stolen watch in a haystack, only to be caught when he boasted, too loudly. Felix's bluster, she suspected, might be his undoing. She resolved to invite Molly for tea tomorrow. a setting where a young girl might speak more freely than under Craddock's stern gaze. And the supplier she would ask Craddock to dig deeper, to trace its owners and drivers. A delivery van, Mrs. Price had said, was seen at Clara's. Could it have carried more than ingredients? Miss Marple's eyes drifted to her garden, where the last roses clung to their stems, defiant against the evening chill. Truth, she knew, was much the same, tenacious, waiting to be uncovered by a patient hand. As the clock struck 9, she set her knitting aside, her thoughts turning to the fate. It would be a stage, she felt, where secrets might slip, where Felix's pride or Molly's nerves could betray them. The village, with its quiet rhythms and hidden currents, was a microcosm of human nature, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, was its keenest observer. The mystery of Clara's muffins was a knot, but she was determined to unravel it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. The confession. The soft glow of lamplight spilled across Miss Jane Marple's parlour, casting delicate shadows on the chintz curtains and the polished oak table where a teapot steamed gently. The room, with its familiar cushioned armchair, a basket of knitting, a vase of late roses, was a haven of quiet order, yet it hummed with the undercurrent of purpose as Miss Marple prepared to receive a visitor. Molly Trent, Clara Honeycutt's young assistant, had accepted her invitation for tea, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and keen insight, intended to coax out the truth that lay tangled in the girl's nervous glances and hesitant words. The mystery of the sabotaged jar peanuts, disguised as oregano, hidden in Clara's kitchen and matched by a true jar in Felix Dutton's shed, had tightened its knot. And Miss Marple sensed that Molly held a thread, however delicate, that could unravel it. The clock on the mantel chimed 4, its notes soft but precise, as a timid knock sounded at the door. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and opened it to find Molly, her fair hair slightly dishevelled, her eyes wide. With apprehension, the girl clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders, as if it could shield her from the weight of the villagers' whispers. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "you're so kind to ask me over. I don't know why you wanted to see me." "Come in, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as the fire crackling in the grate. "A cup of tea will do us both good. These chilly afternoons call for it, don't they?" Molly nodded, stepping into the parlour with the hesitancy of a deer at the edge of a clearing. She settled into a chair, her hands twisting in her lap, and Miss Marple busied herself with the tea tray, pouring Darjeeling into delicate china cups. The ritual was deliberate, its familiarity designed to ease the girl's nerves. Miss Marple knew from long experience her niece's maid, who once confessed a petty theft over a shared pot of tea. That kindness could loosen tongues where questions alone might fail. "You've had a trying time, Molly," Miss Marple said, passing a cup and a plate of shortbread. "With Clara in hospital and all this talk about her muffins, it must weigh on you." Molly's fingers tightened around the cup, her eyes dropping to the steam curling upward. "It's awful," she whispered. "Miss Honeycutt's been so good to me, and now everyone's saying she was careless. But she wasn't. I keep thinking I should have done something, checked that jar more carefully." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes gentle but probing, like a needle testing a seam. "You couldn't have known, dear," she said. "But you did receive that delivery from Upper Mead Supplies, didn't you? The jar of oregano, what we thought was oregano. Tell me about that morning. Every detail helps." Molly's cheeks flushed, and she set her cup down with a faint clink. "It was just a regular delivery," she said, her words tumbling out. The van came at 10, like the ledger said. I signed for it, and there was a crate with the jar inside, sealed tight. I put it in the pantry, and Miss Honeycutt used it the next day. I didn't open it twice, would I? It looked right. Of course, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. But you mentioned Mr. Dutton was there that morning, before the van arrived. Did he say anything, or do anything, that struck you as odd? Molly's eyes widened, and she looked away, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. He was just talking to Miss Honeycutt, she said, her voice barely audible, about recipes, like he does sometimes. He was in the kitchen for a bit, but he left before the delivery. I didn't see him near the pantry, I swear. Miss Marple, needles resting in her lap, clicked once, a soft punctuation to her thoughts. She recalled her old friend, Miss Weatherby, who once coaxed a confession from a housemaid by noting her fidgeting hands. Molly's unease was palpable, a sign of something held back. You're loyal to Clara, Miss Marple said, her tone kind, but firm, and that's admirable. But loyalty can be heavy, dear, especially if it hides a truth. If you know something, even a small thing, it could help Clara. Molly's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her hands to her face. Oh, Miss Marple, she sobbed, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought it was just a prank, not something that could hurt her. Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening though her expression remained serene. A prank, she said gently. Tell me, Molly, what did you do? The girl's sobs deepened, her words spilling out in a rush. It was Mr. Dutton, she said, her voice breaking. He came to the bakery a few weeks ago, after the county fair. He was so angry, said Miss Honeycutt cheated, that her muffins weren't fair. He asked me to help him, said it'd be a joke, just to make her muffins taste bad. He gave me a jar, said it was a spice mix, but I didn't know it was peanuts. I swear I didn't know. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was racing. Go on, dear, she said, pouring more tea as if to steady the girl. What did you do with the jar? Molly wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. He told me to swap it with one in the pantry when Miss Honeycutt wasn't looking. I did. It the morning of the delivery, when he was there. He distracted her, talking about the fair, and I slipped the jar in. He said he'd hidden the real one, so no one would know. I thought it was just a bad flavor, something to make her lose at the fate. But when she got sick, oh, Miss Marple, I was so scared. Miss Marple patted Molly's hand, her touch as light as a feather, but grounding. You've been very brave to tell me this, she said, and you didn't mean harm. But the jar in the pantry, did you see Felix handle it, or was it already prepared? He gave it to me, sealed, Molly said, her voice steadier now. He said he'd ground the spices himself, to make it look like oregano. I didn't open it. I trusted him. He made me swear not to tell, said it'd ruin his reputation if anyone knew. And he promised to help me get a job at his bakery, said I'd do better there. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her thoughts turning to her cousin's son, who once persuaded a friend to hide a stolen watch, promising rewards that never came. Felix has a way with promises, I see, she said softly. And the real jar, did he say where he hid it? Molly nodded, her eyes wide. In his shed, behind the flour sacks. He said no one would look there. I didn't know it was peanuts until I heard about Miss Honeycutt. I wanted to tell someone, but I was so afraid he'd find out. There, Miss Marple said, her voice a bum. You've done the right thing now. Truth, Molly, is like dough, it rises with time, no matter how you try to press it down. Molly's tears slowed, and she managed a shaky nod. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her mind weaving the girl's confession into the larger pattern. Felix had orchestrated the swap, exploiting Molly's youth and loyalty, but his carelessness in hiding the real jar had betrayed him. The shed, the peanut shells, the delivery from Upper Mead Supplies, it was a tapestry of malice, with Felix at its center. Yet the supplier remained a shadow, a loose thread that nagged at her. Was it merely a coincidence, or part of Felix's scheme? She escorted Molly to the door, promising to keep her confidence for now, though she knew Inspector Craddock would need to hear it soon. "Go home and rest, dear," she said. "You've carried this burden long enough." As Molly slipped into the evening, the village settling into a quiet dusk, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting untouched. The fire cast flickering shadows, and she thought of Clara, recovering but still fragile, and of Felix, whose pride had curdled into something dangerous. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary's Mead, when a jealous seamstress snipped a rival's gown, thinking it a harmless slight. Small acts, she knew, could spiral into greater harm, and Felix's prank had nearly cost Clara her life. She opened Clara's notebook, its pages a map of the baker's world, and traced the delivery entry: oregano, 1 pound, Upper Mead Supplies, delivered 10 a.m. Molly received. The supplier, she felt, was the final piece. Felix had used it as a cover, but who drove the van? Who owned the firm? She resolved to urge Craddock to investigate, to trace the chain from supplier to shed. Her eyes drifted to her garden, where the roses glowed faintly in the twilight, their petals clinging against the chill. Truth, she thought, was like those roses, resilient, waiting to be seen by a patient eye. The clock struck 6, and Miss Marple rose, her mind clear. Felix's scheme was unraveling, but she would not rest until every thread was in place. Molly's confession was a turning point, a stitch that held the pattern together. Tomorrow she would share it with Craddock, and together they would confront Felix, whose bluster could no longer hide his guilt. The village, with its quiet rhythms and hidden currents, was a stage, and Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, was its keenest observer. The mystery of Clara's muffins was nearly solved, but she would see it through, one careful loop at a time. Chapter 9. The Confrontation, the Police Station in St. Mary's Mead. A modest brick building tucked behind the village green was rarely a place of high drama, its cells more accustomed to holding errant youths or the occasional poacher than a figure of Felix Dutton's stature. Yet this evening, as the autumn dusk settled over the village, the air inside was taut with anticipation. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag resting on her lap, sat on a wooden bench in the cramped interview room, her presence a quiet counterpoint to Inspector Craddock's restless pacing. Her knitting, for once, remained in her cottage, a sign of the gravity of the moment. Molly Trent's confession, wrung from her trembling lips over tea the previous day, had cast a stark light on Felix's role in Clara Honeycott's near-fatal mishap. And now the time had come to face the rival baker. Felix sat across the scarred oak table, his wiry frame rigid, his dark eyes darting between Craddock and Miss Marple. His apron was gone, replaced by a rumpled jacket, and his hands, usually so busy polishing counters, were clenched into fists. The jar of true oregano from his shed, the peanut shells found nearby, and Molly's account of his scheme to swap the jar in Clara's pantry had tightened the noose around him. Yet his expression was one of defiance, a mask that Miss Marple with her keen insight into human nature, recognized as fragile. Like a teacup cracked but not yet broken, Craddock, his face stern, leaned forward, the evidence bags containing the jar and shells placed prominently on the table. "Mr. Dutton," he said, his voice clipped, "we've got enough to charge you with reckless endangerment, and possibly worse." The jar in Clara Honeycutt's kitchen, labeled oregano but filled with ground peanuts, nearly killed her. The real oregano was found in your shed, along with peanut shells. And we have a witness, Molly Trent, who says you put her up to swapping the jars. Care to explain? Felix's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing. "Molly's lying," he snapped, his voice sharp but unsteady. "That girl's flighty, always has been. She's trying to save her own skin, blaming me for her mistake. I never touched Clara's pantry, and I don't keep peanuts in my shed. Someone planted that evidence you're being played, Inspector." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. She thought of her old neighbor, Mr. Pennington, who once denied stealing a silver spoon, his bluster crumbling when confronted with the spoon itself. Felix's denial was fierce, but it lacked conviction, a thread fraying under scrutiny. "Mr. Dutton," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "It's curious, don't you think, that the jar in your shed matches the one in Clara's kitchen so precisely? And the peanut shells, such an odd thing to find in a baker's shed, unless they were used for a purpose. Molly says you called it a prank, meant to spoil Clara's muffins. But pranks, I've found, can have unintended consequences." Felix's eyes darted to her, his defiance wavering. "A prank," he said, his tone bitter. "I never said that. Molly's making it up. She's the one who works for Clara Shea. Had access to that pantry, not me. Why aren't you questioning her?" Craddock's patience thinned, his voice rising. "Because Molly's not the one with a grudge, Dutton. You lost to Clara at the county fair, and you made no secret of your anger. Witnesses heard you call her a cheat, say she didn't deserve to win. And now we find evidence in your shed, and a witness pointing the finger at you. It's not looking good." Felix's hands unclenched, then clenched again, his knuckles white. "I didn't like losing," he admitted, his voice low. "Who would? Clara's muffins were nothing special, just luck and a fancy ingredient she wouldn't name. But I didn't sabotage her. I'm a baker, not a criminal." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing, like a needle threading a delicate stitch. "A baker's pride is a powerful thing," she said. "I recall a young woman in my knitting circle, Ethel, who snipped a rival's shawl because her own was overlooked. A small act, she thought, but it unraveled her reputation. You were at Clara's bakery the morning of the delivery, weren't you? Molly says. You distracted Clara while she swapped the jar. A clever plan, if it was meant only to spoil her muffins." Felix's face reddened, his voice rising. "I was there, yes, but I didn't tell Molly to do anything. I was just talking to Clara, trying to figure out her recipe. She's always so smug about her secrets. I left before any delivery van showed up. If Molly swapped a jar, she did it on her own." Miss Marple's gaze held his, steady and unyielding. "Molly is young, Mr. Dutton, and young girls can be persuaded by a strong personality. She says you promised her a job at your bakery, a better future. Such promises can sway a loyal heart, even briefly. And the jar in your shed, how did it come to be there, if not by your hand?" Felix's eyes flickered, a crack in his armor. He leaned back, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment silence filled the room, broken only by the distant hum of a passing car. Miss Marple thought of her cousin's son, who once hid a stolen watch, his bravado fading when confronted with the truth. Felix's defiance was crumbling, she sensed, like a poorly baked crust. Craddock seized the moment, his voice firm. "Dutton, we've got the jar, the shells, and Molly's statement. You can keep denying it, but it'll only make things worse. Tell us the truth, and maybe we can talk about intent. Did you mean to harm Clara, or was it really just a prank?" Gone wrong. Felix's hands covered his face, his breath ragged. "All right," he said finally, his voice muffled. "It was a prank. I didn't mean for her to get hurt, I swear. I was angry Clara's win at the fair made me look a fool. Everyone said her muffins were better, and I wanted to knock her down a peg. One ground up some peanuts, made them look like oregano, and gave the jar to Molly. Told her it was a spice mix. Said it'd make Clara's muffins taste awful, cost her the fate. I hid the real jar in my shed, figured no one would look there. I didn't know Clara would eat one. Herself she's allergic, but I thought she'd just serve them." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "A dangerous assumption, Mr. Dutton," she said softly. "Clara always tastes her creations. You knew her allergy, didn't you? It's common knowledge in the village." Felix's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't mean to kill her. I thought she'd spit it out, maybe lose a few customers. I'm not a monster." Craddock's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "You're admitting to tampering with the jar then? You gave it to Molly, knowing it could harm Clara?" Felix nodded, his face ashen. "Yes, but it was just to ruin her muffins. I didn't think it through. When I heard she was in hospital, I panicked. Tried to keep Molly quiet. Told her it was our secret. I didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her thoughts turning to her old friend Miss Lavinia, who once uncovered a theft by listening to a servant's guilty ramblings. Felix's confession was a turning point, but it left questions unanswered. The supplier, Upper Mead Supplies, lingered in her meader shadow that had yet to take shape. "The delivery van," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "Molly says it came after you left, but the jar was already prepared. Did you arrange for it to be delivered, or was it a coincidence?" Felix shook his head, his voice hoarse. "I didn't arrange it. I gave Molly the jar myself, told her to swap it when Clara wasn't looking. The delivery was real. Clara ordered oregano, and I used it as cover. I knew Molly would be unpacking, so I timed my visit. The suppliers got nothing to do with it." Craddock made a note, his expression grim. "We'll check that out, but for now, you're under arrest, Dutton. Reckless endangerment, at the least. If the Crown sees intent, it could be attempted murder." Felix's shoulders sagged, his defiance gone. "I didn't mean for this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was just a stupid prank." Miss Marple rose, her handbag clutched tightly, her eyes soft but unyielding. "Jealousy, Mr. Dutton, is a poor ingredient," she said. "It spoils more than muffins. You've done Clara a great wrong, and it's only by chance she's alive." As Jenkins led Felix to a cell, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, a grudging respect in his eyes. "You were right about him," he said. "Molly's confession broke the case, but you saw it coming." "How do you do it?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as benign as a Sunday hymn. "People are much the same, Inspector, whether in a village or a city. Like my old cook, who hid her mistakes in the pantry, hoping no one would look. One only needs to watch and listen. They stepped outside, the night air cool and sharp, the village quiet under a sky pricked with stars. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara, recovering in hospital, and to Molly, whose guilt would linger despite her honesty. The supplier, Upper Mead Supplies, remained a loose thread. Felix's claim that it was unconnected rang true, but she would urge Craddock to confirm it. She recalled her gardener's boy, who once hid a stolen apple in a haystack, only to be caught when a stray core was found. Small details, she knew, could tie up even the smallest doubts as they walked toward her cottage. The village lights winking through the darkness, Miss Marple felt the mystery nearing its end. Felix's confession was the final stitch, but the pattern needed one last inspection to ensure no threads were missed. Tomorrow she would visit Clara to reassure her that justice was near. The golden loaf would reopen, its warmth restored, and St. Mary's Mead would heal, its trust in its baker reaffirmed. Truth, Miss Marple thought, was like her knitting. Patient work revealed its shape, one careful loop at a time. Chapter 10. The village restored. The morning sun broke over St. Mary's Mead in a wash of gold, burnishing the thatched roofs and coaxing a faint warmth from the autumn chill. The village, with its winding lanes and tidy cottages, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief, as if the air itself had cleared after the storm of Clara Honeycutt's misfortune. The golden loaf, shuttered for days, was stirring back to life, its windows flung open to let in the light, and the faint scent of baking bread drifted once more onto the high street. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked slowly toward the bakery, her sensible shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the cobblestones. Her knitting, for the moment, remained at home, a sign that her focus was on tying up the final threads of the mystery that had gripped the village. Felix Dutton's arrest the previous evening had sent ripples through St. Mary's Mead, the news spreading faster than a summer breeze. His confession wrung from him under the weight of Molly Trent's testimony. The damning jar of oregano from his shed and the stray peanut shells had confirmed his role in the sabotage of Clara's muffins. The act, meant as a petty prank to spoil her reputation, had nearly cost her life. Exploiting her known allergy to peanuts with a jar deceptively labelled as oregano, Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, had unravelled the scheme, and now, as she approached the golden loaf, she felt the satisfaction of a pattern completed, like a shawl knitted to its final stitch. The bakery door stood ajar, and inside, Clara Honeycutt, pale but resolute, was directing a small army of volunteers. Her recovery had been swift, thanks to Dr. Haydock's care, and her determination to reopen was a testament to her spirit. The counter gleamed, freshly polished, and trays of scones and loaves were emerging from the oven, their golden crusts a promise of normalcy. Clara, her apron dusted with flour, caught sight of Miss Marple and hurried over, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Miss Marple," she said, clasping her hands, "I can't thank you enough. They told me it was you who sorted it all out, Felix. The jar, everything. I'm back because of you." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, hardly, dear," she said, her voice as gentle as the morning light. "I merely asked a few questions. The truth has a way of rising, like your dough. I'm so pleased to see you well." Clara gestured to a tray of muffins, their tops studded with currants. "These are no secret herbs this time, just good, honest ingredients. I've checked every jar myself. Will you try one?" Miss Marple accepted a muffin, its warmth comforting in her hands, and took a small bite. The flavor was simple, sweet, and perfect, a reminder of Clara's skill. "Delicious," she said, "and safe, I trust." Clara's laugh was soft but hearty. "Safe as houses, Miss Marple. I've got Molly double-checking everything now, though the poor girl's still shaken." Molly Trent, hovering near the oven, glanced up at the mention of her name. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with guilt, but she managed a shy smile. Miss Marple nodded to her, recalling their tea the previous day, when Molly's confession had broken the case open. The girl had been a pawn in Felix's scheme, persuaded by promises of a better job, unaware of the danger in the jar she swapped. Her honesty, though late, had saved her from complicity, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for her youth and vulnerability as the bakery filled with villagers. Their voices a cheerful hum, Miss Marple stepped outside where Mrs. Dolly Bantry was waiting, her hat adorned with an extravagant feather that bobbed in the breeze. "Jane," she exclaimed, hurrying over, "you've done it again." Felix Dutton, of all people, trying to ruin Clara. "I heard it from Mrs. Price, who heard it from the constable's wife. You must tell me everything." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her hands clasping her handbag. "There's little to tell, Dolly," she said. Felix let his pride get the better of him, as people often do. He thought a prank would dim Clara's star, but he underestimated her and the villagers' loyalty. "It reminds me of my old cook, Mrs. Bates, who hid a burnt pie in the pantry, hoping no one would notice. But secrets, you know, have a way of coming out." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But how did you know it was Felix? I mean, the jar, the peanuts, it's so devious. And Molly, poor thing, caught up in it all." "Molly was misled," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "Young girls are impressionable, Dolly. I recall a maid in my cousin's house. WHO hid a stolen brooch for a charming footman, thinking it love. Felix used Molly's trust, but she came clean in the end. As for Felix, his bitterness was plain to see. The county fair left a wound, and wounds fester if not tended." They strolled toward the village green, where preparations for the fete were in full swing. Stalls were rising, their canvas tops fluttering, and children darted about, carrying baskets of apples and ribbons. The baking contest, now to be judged by Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, promised to be a highlight, though Felix's absence cast a shadow. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the horizon, where Upper Meadsfields lay, and she thought of the supplier, Upper Mead Supplies. The last loose thread in the mystery, Inspector Craddock had confirmed that morning that the supplier was legitimate, a small firm with no ties to Felix beyond routine deliveries. The van that brought the oregano to Clara's had been a coincidence, its arrival providing Felix the cover to slip Molly the tainted jar. Miss Marple, ever cautious, had urged Craddock to double-check the driver's records, but the man was a local with no connection to the baker. The truth, it seemed, was simpler than she'd feared. Felix's scheme was his alone, born of envy and executed with reckless cunning. As they reached the green, Mrs. Bantry linked arms with Miss Marple, her voice brimming with admiration. "You're a marvel, Jane. The way you see through people, it's like you've got a map of their hearts. How do you do it?" Miss Marple chuckled softly, her eyes scanning the bustling fete. "It's no map, Dolly, just observation. People are much the same, whether in St. Mary's Mead or London. Their motives, jealousy, pride, fear are, like the stitches in my knitting, always forming the same patterns. One only needs to look closely. Mrs. Bantry sighed, her feather bobbing. Well, I'm glad Clara's back. The golden loaf's the heart of this village, and Felix will he go to prison? Reckless endangerment, at the least, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. The Crown may push for more, given Clara's allergy was known, but Felix's confession and Molly's will weigh in his favour. He meant to harm her reputation, not her life. Still, a lesson learned too late is a hard one. They paused by a stall selling jams, where Mrs. Price was holding court, her pince-nez glinting as she recounted Felix's downfall to a cluster of villagers. Arrested, she declared, her voice carrying. All because he couldn't stand Clara's muffins beating his... Miss Marple saw right through him, you know. Miss Marple's cheeks warmed, but she waved off the praise, her modesty as genuine as her insight. She thought of Clara, kneading dough in her kitchen, and of Molly, learning to trust her own judgment. The village would heal, its rhythms restored, but the memory of Felix's betrayal would linger, a cautionary tale for those tempted by envy, as the sun climbed higher, bathing the green in light. Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return for the fate's opening. She walked home, her steps unhurried, her mind at ease, but still turning over the case. The supplier, the jar, the schedule had aligned, yet she wondered if she'd missed a subtler thread, a motive beyond Felix's pride. She recalled her old friend, Miss Hartnell, who once found a hidden letter in a parish register, revealing a grudge no one suspected. But here the truth seemed clear, the pattern complete. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire, the crackle of logs a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. She retrieved her knitting, the pale blue shawl nearly finished, and let her needles move, their rhythm a mirror of her mind. The golden loaf was open, Clara was safe, and Felix would face justice. St. Mary's Mead, with its quiet beauty and hidden currents, was itself again, its heart beating in the bakery's warmth. As the clock struck noon, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes drifting to the garden, where the last roses glowed against the frost. Truth, she thought, was like those roses, fragile yet enduring, blooming under the patient gaze of one who knew where to look. The mystery of Clara's muffins was solved, its threads woven into a whole, and Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom, felt the quiet satisfaction of a job well done.